We're going to talk today about Pierce's career, about being a journalist and a celebrity as well, about interacting with celebrities. But I think we're going to start with a brief discussion about an interview that Pierce conducted with me in the UK a couple of weeks ago, as of the taping date of this interview and discussion. So it seems to have attracted a fair bit of positive attention, I would say, perhaps for both of us. And what do you make of it?
Well, first of all, it showed me what my belief was before I interviewed you, which is that you are an internet phenomenon in all guises. The attention that the interview attracted online was, by our standards of our fledgling show and network of 6 months or so, absolutely staggering. In fact, right up there with my first interview, which was Donald Trump. So I found that very interesting, to go into a world on YouTube in particular, in which you are so dominant and so well known, to see that an interview could be cut up in the way that we did it, with various clips, and see each of them be watched by millions and millions of people. And I found that very interesting. It also played into my sort of sense that the most interesting interviews actually are with people who have something to say. You know, you and I both know that we've interviewed lots of people over the years who often don't have very much to say for themselves, and they could be the most famous people on the planet but be incredibly boring. I would rather take interesting, controversial, polarizing, perhaps divisive people, or certainly the way that they are portrayed perhaps by the media, and interview those types of people, because it makes for more interesting interviews. So I found the experience of interviewing you fascinating. It lived up to every expectation. It was surprisingly moving. You got surprisingly emotional at one stage, which I wasn't expecting. But I think that it also, I thought, showed you in an extremely good light. And I don't mean that as false flattery. I just think that you came over as, to me, very sincere when you showed that emotion. And it also showed me that even someone like you, that's been criticized a lot as well as praised, that certain things do permeate your skin and do genuinely upset you. And I was surprised by that, but I also thought that appeared to be very genuine. So I thought the whole experience for me, Jordan, was fascinating. I think I said to you, my 3 sons, who are all in their 20s, they were the most excited I'd ever seen them about an interview, outside of Cristiano Ronaldo, our mutual friend from the world of football, which I found very interesting, because they're 3 boys in their 20s, all quite different, but they all watch YouTube avidly, and they perceive you to be the sort of king of YouTube, up there with Joe Rogan and a few others. And so they found it an utterly compelling interview. And they were able to compare it to many that you'd done, and felt that it was right up there with one of the best they'd seen. So I was very pleased professionally that actually I felt I'd conducted a good interview. But I do come back to the basic premise, I think, of any interviewer. You're only really as good as the tools that you work with. And in your case, you came, I think, prepared to be very open, to be very honest, to be emotional. And I found that actually very moving.
So you said a couple of things there, I would say, on the technological front that I thought were very interesting. So one of the things about YouTube, I would say, perhaps that distinguishes it in some way from legacy TV, is that YouTube really rewards straightforward, untrammeled, and unscripted discussion. And it's really what people expect on the platform. And the fact that the discussions can go for a long while without any of the somewhat artificial constraints that are placed on the broadcast medium means that people can and or are more likely to reveal themselves in all their positive and negative aspects. And I think that's part of the reason that Rogan has become so popular, apart from the fact that Joe always asks questions that are actually questions, right? He's always, in some sense, honestly digging for information, rather than trying to set someone up or play for a cheap laugh or a cheap takedown, which is something that's very characteristic of a certain type of journalist. And that doesn't play well at all on YouTube, interestingly enough. It makes people infamous very rapidly. And so it's an interesting medium in that regard, partly because of the lack of restriction on bandwidth. And then you also mentioned the clips issue. And one of the things that's quite remarkable about YouTube and makes talking there much different than publishing a book, let's say, Well, first of all, the audience is much broader on YouTube than it is on the publishing front by an order of magnitude, likely, which is a lot. But also, you can't sell a book by the sentence or the paragraph. But YouTube videos are infinitely fractionable, and you can clip 1 minute or 3 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and there's an independent market for every one of those length of clips. And so that's a very interesting new technological possibility to delve into. And you've seen TikTok emerge and YouTube Shorts and Instagram, all these social media platforms that have their own culture that capitalize on that capacity to fractionate YouTube or to fractionate video. And so it's very interesting to try to contend with all that. I also thought, for what it's worth, that you talked to me in a very straightforward manner, and I certainly appreciated that. I had many people on my team who were concerned about the potential manner in which the interview might proceed, not least because we've had plenty of fun with British journalists before, although that often turned out well. But you also said during that interview, or maybe it was before we talked, that you had been thinking about listening in a way that was somewhat new for you, or at least new in part. I mean, everybody learns as they go along. And so I was curious afterwards about what exactly that meant, because I really felt that during the interview, you did listen to me, and that we had, and vice versa, hopefully, and that as a consequence, we genuinely communicated. And I think that was part of the reason that made the interview successful.
Yeah, I mean, it was my middle son, who's a young actor and photographer, and listens avidly to YouTube. And most of your stuff he's watched in recent years, most of Joe Rogan's stuff he's watched. And he said, "Dad, look, you can't do your normal sledgehammer act. You can't just go in and start interrupting every 5 seconds like you normally do," which is it's a fault line of mine. It works well, actually, when you're interviewing a politician who's trying to obfuscate or answer different questions or simply avoid the one you're asking. Sometimes you do have to be slightly bully boy in the way you interrupt a politician to get an answer out of them. So it's a different technique. But actually, the point that my son Stanley made to me was that, said, "Dad, if you want to get the best out of Jordan Peterson," he said, "trust me, you have to listen." And so that was constantly in the back of my mind. He was actually at the back of the studio, as you know, with my youngest son, Bertie. And he was adamant that that was the way I would get the best out of you. And he was completely right. And it was a learning curve for me. It might sound slightly odd that I'm getting to this stage of my life, 57 years old, and been a journalist for, since I was in my early 20s, to suddenly learn the art of interviewing. But I've been through many guises as a journalist and interviewer. When you're a newspaper interviewer, as I was for many years, or I did big interviews also for GQ magazine, often the interviewer can talk a lot to get a one-line revelation. So you can keep talking, keep talking, and then lull your interviewee into saying something that maybe you were trying to get. It's a very different discipline on television or on any form of on-camera interview. And I was also struck by the fact this wasn't the first person who'd given me the advice to listen. I remember the great Sir David Frost, who did, with the Watergate interviews with Richard Nixon, some of the great interviews ever seen in political journalism. And he always said to me, the most powerful tool of any television interviewer is silence, because the interviewee will always fill that void. At some stage, after 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds, an interviewee will fill the gap. They won't just sit there in silence too. And sometimes the most powerful revelations you can get from people come when they have their own moment to really think about what they're going to say, and they say it. And if you're too busy, as you said earlier, and I've been very guilty of this myself, of talking too much, expressing your own opinions, not really listening to what the person is saying, then you can sometimes miss these moments of real gold, which come actually from the power of silence. So I think that, I think the experience I had with you was really informative to me of when you're interviewing somebody, obviously very intelligent, obviously very used to doing interviews, perhaps coming with a slight sense of suspicion after what happened with you on Channel 4 News. And I watched that interview live, as I told you. And I just felt in that interview, I know the interviewer, Cathy Newman, and I felt that she didn't really know who you were, hadn't done quite enough research into what you really felt and what you really thought, and had made a series of presumptions about you, which you were able to bat away quite quickly. And it made for very uncomfortable viewing if you were a Channel 4 News viewer, because it was quite clear that you were slightly on parallel lines. So I think that, I found our experience really, really good, actually. I felt that had I done my political interview technique with you, I think you would have clammed up. It would have been, well, you wouldn't have clammed up, but I think it would have been a much more confrontational exchange, which I wasn't seeking to get, because I actually agree with a lot of what you say. So to me, it does depend who the interviewee is.